Lucius Pinarius Scarpus, governor of Cyrenaica around 31 BCE. Scarpus is one of the other cousins of Octavian and yet another nephew of Julius Caesar. Of all of Caesar's male relatives who were engaged in politics, Scarpus is easily the most obscure of the lot. We know next to nothing about him as a person, and we have only a handful of snippets of his career. Yet we know that he was wealthy, well-connected, and politically viable. In this video, I'd like to look at his career so far as we can reconstruct it, and also consider why he is so obscure. As with his older cousin Quintus Pedius, the most important relationship in Scarpus's life was to one Gaius Julius Caesar, who was dictator at the time that Scarpus was coming of age. Lucius Pinarius Scarpus was the grandnephew of Caesar and the grandson of his sister, Julia the Elder. Scholars have typically assumed that Scarpus was very close in age to Octavian, meaning that he would have been born around the year 63 BCE. The reason for this assumption is not entirely clear, but I have no grounds to challenge it. Gens Pinaria was an ancient patrician house which was one of the first houses to ever hold the consulship, so that in itself meant that the name Pinarius was quite advantageous and prestigious. The family also held an ancestral priesthood. Those were not common in the Roman world, those were more of a Greek thing usually, so that is a fairly special distinction. For Scarpus, this would have also been an asset. He was cousins with Quintus Pedius, who was quite a bit older, Octavia the Younger, who later married Marc Antony, and Octavian, who later became the Emperor Augustus. On March 15, 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. Soon thereafter his will was read out, and Lucius Pinarius Scarpus was one of his three heirs. Of course, Octavian famously received 3/4 of Caesar's estate, but then two cousins, Quintus Pedius and Lucius Pinarius Scarpus, each received 1/8 of the remaining estate. Along with Quintus Pedius, Scarpus elected to hand over his share of the inheritance to Octavian to keep the estate together and to signal that Octavian was the true heir to Caesar, both financially and politically. As I speculated in my video on Quintus Pedius, I believe that he would have been the one to convince Scarpus to do this rather than the other way around. Pedius was a fairly seasoned politician by that point, and he certainly understood the power of having a unified estate and presenting a unified front right after a major political figure was assassinated. For reasons that are unclear, Scarpus became a follower of Marc Antony during the Second Triumvirate. During the Liberator's Civil War, when both Antony and Octavian commanded large armies against Cassius and Brutus, Scarpus actually served as an officer in Antony's army. My speculation would be that Scarpus came to regret his decision to hand over his share of the estate to his cousin Octavian, and that therefore he decided to hitch his wagon to Antony instead, as a way to try to get back and to not be bound to his cousin. I have to assume, based on the context, that Scarpus remained in Antony's service from 40 down to 32. During that 8-year stretch, it's unclear exactly what he would have been up to, but most likely he would have accompanied Antony on some of his campaigns, or else he would have governed and done other missions. At any rate, by the year 32, Antony had sufficient trust in young Scarpus to make him one of his major commanders going into the final war of the Roman Republic. In 32, when war became inevitable, it looked like it was going to be a long, drawn-out contest between two equal factions. 1/3 of the Senate decided to cast its lot with Marc Antony and simply walked out of Rome and left for Greece, where they joined up with Antony and his fleet. Going into the war, it would have been very difficult to predict a winner, and I think that a lot of people who thought that they were being the smart people of the time bet on Antony as the more experienced soldier. However, Antony had some issues going into that war, such as being fresh off of a major defeat at the hands of the Parthians, and of course, as most of you already know, Antony did not end up being the winner of this conflict. At any rate, though, Antony entrusted Scarpus with a key position at Cyrenaica and 4 legions. 4 legions is a fairly considerable army in almost any context, but when you consider that Cyrenaica is a place where you can really only support an army right along the coast because of water limitations, this was about as big of an army as Antony could have spared. Not only that, but Cyrenaica lays astride the route from Roman Africa to Egypt. Antony's wife, the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra VII, wanted her homeland defended by land, whereas she had her fleet to defend it by sea. She knew that Egypt was a breadbasket and that Octavian coveted possession of Egypt. Cyrenaica was a forward defense post to protect the granary of Antony's half of the empire, effectively. So Scarpus really was in a major position of authority. Not only that, but Antony also entrusted Scarpus with minting coins in his name. So Scarpus put out a whole series of coins featuring both Antony's name and his own, which coincidentally is also Scarpus's primary claim to fame, since you can look up coins that he designed and printed. When Antony's forces clashed with Octavian at Actium, the result was an almost total victory for Octavian. It was truly one of the most decisive battles in all of antiquity. Antony's fleet and army were effectively destroyed. After the battle, Antony escaped to Egypt and tried to cobble together another force to resist Octavian. The first person, or one of the first people that he wrote to, was Lucius Pinarius Scarpus, who of course had 4 legions relatively nearby. However, Scarpus was able to read the tea leaves well enough to know that the defeat at Actium was decisive and that Antony's cause was one that had no chance of succeeding. So Scarpus took the simple expedient of having the messengers put to death, and then he dispatched his own messengers to Octavian to sue for peace. Octavian, in return for Scarpus surrendering without a fight, agreed to confirm Scarpus as governor of Cyrenaica and to allow Scarpus to continue to mint coins. Another thing that Scarpus had to do in his capacity as governor was to help Octavian's legate Gaius Cornelius Gallus and his men pass through Cyrenaica on their way to Alexandria. So it was a pretty good trade, and Scarpus clearly emerged as a winner of that deal. He got to keep his position despite choosing the losing side. I have to imagine, based on the fact that both of them were members of the Caesar family and that Scarpus had been named in Caesar's will, that Octavian did view Scarpus as a potential political hazard. That being said, he clearly didn't think that Scarpus was an immediate danger since he allowed him to stay in office, and there are also some coins where we see that Scarpus continued to make coins in the name of his cousin Octavian. So the threat must not have been an existential one. The obscurity of Lucius Pinarius Scarpus is such that we don't know when his tenure as governor ended, and we also have no idea what else he did in his career or when and how he died. Which is an odd thing. This man was named in Caesar's will, and he was one of the major participants in the final civil war of the Roman Republic. So what happened to him? Well, there's a pretty good chance that Octavian may have had him quietly put out of the way. Most likely Octavian would have used somewhat peaceful means, but with a glint of steel behind his words, meaning that perhaps Scarpus was encouraged to retire on the understanding that if he didn't, bad things would happen. That is the most Augustus way to handle such a situation. As for why Scarpus remained so obscure despite being such a well-connected and powerful guy, I think that it owes to the combination of his youth and lack of achievement when he emerged on the scene. Someone like, say, Lucius Julius Caesar had some stuff under his belt. He had been a consul and a censor. Quintus Pedius had partaken in several campaigns. He had distinguished himself at the Battle of Munda, and he also served as consul alongside of Octavian the very first time that Octavian had held that office, meaning that it was necessary to list him, since Octavian in all of his official propaganda would want to talk about the first time that he took up arms on behalf of the Republic, and he would need to name his colleague in order to indicate what year it was. For Scarpus, he had no such distinction. Really, the problem was that he chose the losing faction, and that his cousin, who was therefore his major opponent, was a master of propaganda and narrative control. Scarpus is a somewhat embarrassing figure from where Octavian sat, because he was also related to Caesar and arguably had an equal, or at least some claim to be Caesar's political heir. Unlike many far more important Romans, Scarpus's time as a mentor actually meant that he left behind more artifacts than almost any of the Romans that I've talked about in my previous videos. So, if not for his coins, however, it is very unlikely that he would have ever come to my attention. Scarpus, of all of Caesar's relatives, is, I think, the most obscure, and it's because, unlike most of his other relatives, he didn't have quite enough sense to get behind Octavian when it was clear that Octavian was now the primary inheritor of not only Caesar's estate, but also of his legacy.